Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're going from 1500 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games, where I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I can for your education and entertainment. Here we have a Caro Kann, and my opponent goes for the advanced variation with e5. If you see some of my other videos on the channel, you'll know that the main move that I play here is c5, but I've recently been experimenting with bishop to f5, which is kind of the normal main line, which I've been trying to learn, so we'll see how I get on. Whoa, okay. C4. C4. I do not know this move. Is this a move? Okay, well, two things are running through my head, and this is going to be very instructive because you are going to get positions in the opening, a few moves in, when your opponent plays something and you genuinely don't know what's going on. That's going to happen. I mean, online, I'm 2250 rated in Blitz. Over the board, I'm 2000 rated. I don't know this, right? So I've got to figure this out, and I'll talk you through what I'm thinking. So the first thing that I'm thinking is, okay, I don't really want to trade off my d-pawn because my d-pawn is quite strong, so maybe I should play e6 and just continue normal development. My own, because like if my opponent takes, I'll take back, or with the c-pawn even, and we just get an ideal advance caro where the d-pawn is a massive weakness because there's no pawn to c3 to defend it. However, if I play e6, my opponent firstly can just continue applying pressure and developing. He doesn't have to take. Secondly, is c5 a problem? Kind of squeezing my position where it's unclear how I'm going to develop properly. Also, b6 can always be met with b4, maybe? a5... I don't know. I'm just not convinced that we can really break apart that structure. If I do take something like take, and pawn e6, the d-pawn is very, very weak. It's a backwards pawn, and we control the square in front of it very nicely. So I'm leaning towards taking, and I think I'm going to do that. And even if this isn't necessarily the best move, I don't think it can be really bad. And I mean, if my opponent doesn't take, then we can probably play b5 and just hold on to the pawn. So he does take. And I think we can just play pawn e6. And so we've got our bishop outside the pawn chain, which is ideal. This knight poses no danger. It's fully controlled by my pawn on c6. We're a little bit behind in development, sure. It's also a little bit unclear how we're going to apply any significant pressure to the d4 pawn, because we can't get a knight to c6 unless we play c5, which I don't want to play. So I guess we just do this. Knight d7, knight b6 with tempo on the bishop, just adding even more control to the d5 square. Can maybe even put our knight on d5. We are, like I said, slightly behind in development. I'm not overly concerned about that, though, because the position is very closed in the center, right? White does not have the d5 pawn break. I am the one with the central pawn break, and I can choose when to execute that. And because I'm behind in development, I don't want to execute the pawn break because my king is stuck in the center. So, you know, if c5 happens, for example, this diagonal becomes weak, and I get punished for having a king still in the center of the board. So let's go knight b6. Pretty easy move to play, hitting the bishop. If bishop d3, then I will happily trade and then get my knight to the light squares. So he goes bishop b3. We could push a5, trying to go after the bishop, but it feels wrong to me because we destabilize this knight massively. It has no pawns guarding it. Obviously, it's got a queen, but it feels like a destabilizing move. So I'm not going to play it. We could... Well, no, knight d5 makes no sense because white would love to force us to have a pawn on d5 because that would actually strengthen his d4 pawn because we would lose access to it via the d file. One of the other things I'm thinking is just queen d7 and castle queenside, but again, that doesn't quite feel correct. I also like the look of bishop g4. I know I've already moved the bishop to f5, but basically saying that I'm threatening to take, and if you take with the queen, I'll win the d4 pawn. Also, I free up the f5 square for the knight, which is the main point of it. Because the knight on g6 is kind of pointless. It doesn't really do anything useful. Whereas on f5, it targets d4, which is very useful. So, I'm thinking knight e7 is the move I want to play. To go bishop g4 followed by knight f5. However, on knight g7, can my opponent play knight to h4? Because my queen no longer hits that square and my bishop is now under attack. And I can't really save the bishop. So maybe I should play h6. Firstly, taking away the g5 square. Secondly, giving my bishop the h7 square to retreat to. Also, when we castle, we'll have some luft. I don't think that can be a bad move, to be honest. I'm going to play it. It's also just quite thematic in these Caro/London type structures. Okay, h3, stopping bishop to g4. Okay, that's fine. I'm not too concerned. We can always drop the bishop back and bring the knight to f5. We could even bring the knight to g6 and then to h4 to try and get a knight trade, which would be interesting. Let's go knight e7. Thinking about it, we could also put the knight on d5. Basically, by the way, now the point is that knight h4 is met with bishop h7, and the bishop can get away. So even though we're allowing knight to h4, it doesn't do anything now, because we just retreat the bishop, and the knight is just a target on the h4 square. That's the whole point of pawn h6, as well as just stopping anything from coming to g5, which could be annoying in the future. And also, like I said, the center of the board is closed. Again, as I said, we have the pawn break with pawn c5, which I may or may not play ever. White does not have pawn d5 ever, because we control that square like 5 different times. Like, he's just never getting d5 in. So, because the center of the board is locked shut, the fact that we're behind in development isn't a big deal. I'm thinking about the move knight d5 right now. That's the move I want to play, and I think I'm going to play it. Now, I'm not going to take his knight, because that would only help him. He would take back with the b pawn, put the pawn on c3. We don't have good access to the c3 pawn, which is the base of the pawn chain, right? Which would mean his d4 pawn is actually really strong. A pawn chain is only as strong as its base. That's a very good rule of thumb. Here, this is... Okay, my opponent just gave me a knight. Well, that's very lovely of him, but it also kind of ruined my whole explanation. Well, that's, yeah, really kind of him. I don't... Yeah, and now he's just trading with me. Okay. What? Yeah, well, I'm going to take with the e-pawn rather than the c-pawn, because if I take with the c-pawn, then queen to a4 check, and my king has to move, which, I mean, I'm still probably winning, but why would I want to allow that? Let's just take with the e-pawn, keep this diagonal shut. E6 is never going to happen. We control that very nicely. What I was saying before my opponent gave me a free knight is that we're never going to take, because then the base of the pawn chain would be quite strong. And I'll talk you through this after the game. By the way, if you're enjoying so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. And let's convert this game. So for those of you thinking, oh, the game is just over, we're up a piece. Yeah, we are up a piece. This is probably winning. G5, G4 looks very strong. Although I'm going to start with bishop to E7 to be nice and solid. Okay, I am actually just realizing my queen is a little bit vulnerable now that I've just gotten rid of her retreat. Oh, no, we have several squares, actually. We have e4 if we need it, so that's all right. G3, yeah, we have e4, or we have h3, that's okay. Sorry, what I'm saying is, the game is not over. Some of you would find a way to lose this with the black pieces. I say this in lots of my videos because it's true. Okay, here I love the move bishop to g5, which offers a bishop trade, of course. And we are hitting the queen and the bishop, essentially forcing the move f4, which is the only way to decline the trade. And then I'll just drop my bishop back. And now I've made white commit to f4. And he's just weakening the squares in front of his king. Again, I'm very much prepared for a move like g5. Wait, am I blundering? Yeah, kind of. Well, not really. Queen h5, g4 forks my queen and my bishop, but I will happily take that. We are up a whole piece, so now I'm up 2 pawns, but it's much better than that because the white king is completely stranded. Probably play g5? g5, rook g1, queen h5, check, king g2. Yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of that. Not the biggest fan. Let's give a check. King g2. What do I want to do here? I think what I want to do is give the check on g6. And then probably put the queen on a square like e4. I... Ooh, no, 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 no. That's certainly not the way to go. Now we get bishop to h4. And yeah, you can defend like that. That would have been a terrible blunder. But I will just happily trade pieces. That's fine by me. I'll bring my queen to e4 with check. And probably play g6. Looks like the most solid move. You may be tempted to castle to defend g7, but you're kind of asking for trouble after white doubles on the g file. There's no need for that. Okay. He's creating decent counterplay. He is creating some decent counterplay. I think a6 is probably the easiest move. If a5, then b5. Yeah, I don't love that. Let's just go a6 and stop pawn to b5. I'm expecting a4, just to try and force this move through. No, okay, goes after the queen. Well, I was just going to drop the queen back to f5. The queen is perfectly safe. We're also preventing the move e6, which we don't want white to be able to play, keeping pressure on f4. We have checking options on h5. What we need to now do is try and get our rooks into the game. It's difficult, though, because while we are up 2 pawns, we don't really have any clear open lines for our rooks to use to enter the game. And we also would like to try... Whoa. No, that just doesn't work. No. No. I'm probably just going to go king f7. Is that playable? Okay, we have this checking option if we want it. I'm expecting him to double up. But then I think we can castle kingside. Okay, no, this isn't good enough, because now we can bring our king to f7. Let me think. Yeah. We can bring our king to f7. We can put our rooks on e8 and g8 if we really want. We're up 3 pawns now. We do have, like, you know, kind of a weak king, for sure. But we're going to try to consolidate. We're going to try to consolidate. So we probably want to play moves like rook e8, king g7, and rook to f8, something along those lines. As I said, we can always give a check if we want to, but for now, it doesn't do anything. We should just leave our queen on f6 and have this in our back pocket if we want it. It effectively gives us access to more squares at a moment's notice. Okay, queen f3. Not really sure what that does. g5 is an interesting move, but I don't think it really works. I think we should probably just bring our rook to e8 to overprotect the e6 pawn, so that our king and queen can do other things. Again, I also want to play king g7 to allow our rook to come to f8 and go after the f4 pawn. We need to open lines for our rooks to get involved in the game. We don't want them just to be passive defensive pieces. Okay, that's all right. If here, yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, this is the idea. We could also consider moves like h5, which would actually set a very nice trap. h5 would set a nice trap. I think rook h to f8 is probably the easiest move. Maybe not. Maybe not. I don't know. I think h5. Point being, oh no, you can't do that anymore because the rook steps off of the g file, but there was a trap there. If h5, queen h3, then we win this. That looks good to me. If you take here, well, I can just take here with check, actually. So, you can't do anything like that. I'd go up a rook and a lot more. Now there's less pressure on e6. We can bring our rook over here. White can take on h5, but it doesn't really do anything because we'll take on f4, and the queen is also pinned to the king. So we force a queen trade. And we are up 3 pawns at the end of the day. So white can't allow trades, which is why he's having to play defense with rook to f3. Which is not a very active move. Okay, how should we continue? h4, I think, is an overextension. It doesn't really do anything useful. King h6 is a move that I like the look of, because this is now probably a threat. I think this makes a lot of sense. Just keeping pressure. e6 is well defended. I think I want to go queen e7 and rook f5. I think that's what I want to do. Okay, that doesn't really change anything. Yeah, I think I like this. If here... The point is I have to keep an eye on queen g5 check, because it could be annoying. Here. If here, then here. I could get 2 rooks against the queen, followed by, like, rook e4 and winning all the pawns. Which, to be honest, is maybe actually a good way to win, but it also gives material imbalance that seems unnecessary. We'll see if my opponent finds it. I think this is the most resilient move. If you don't do that, if you play a move like a3 defending the b4 pawn, then we get rook f5. Yeah. And now we offer a rook trade, which, I mean, you can't accept, because I'll open up the e file and invade very easily. That seems like it's just losing for white. Okay. Now we probably double up. I don't want to be too gung-ho with taking. Maybe I force trades, but I don't know. There's not really a massive rush, I don't think. e6 is still defended. If rook e3, we can take on f4 with check, which looks great. We could also play a move like rook 8 to f6 to keep an eye on the pawns if we need to. Okay. Let's take. Now that we have our rook on the f-file. I'm expecting him to take with the d-pawn to try to keep more pieces on the board. Yeah, he does. We need to keep an eye on this. I think rook to f5 is a very, very nice move here. Stopping any f4 shenanigans in the future. Keeping an eye on g5. Keeping an eye on the f-pawn. Also, the e-pawn could be useful. Yeah, this looks very nice. Again, we are up 3 pawns. We could push this if we really want, but it doesn't feel like it's necessary. I think it makes more sense to go for a move like c5 and try to exploit the white king, which I'm going to play without much thought because, I mean, white just, he can't allow this, surely. Our king is completely safe on h6, by the way, because this rook is monitoring g5 very nicely. And yeah, if our queen invades, we're probably going to be able to force some kind of trade. All right. Let's take. I'll win a fourth pawn very happily. And I mean, you can try and invade on a7 or something. That's the only square you can go to, because I control all the others. But, you know, you can't even come to f8 with jack. Maybe you can make your way to h8 with mate, maybe. Okay, here I think the very instructive move is probably... is it? No, it's easier just to go queen b3 check. What am I on about? Forcing a queen trade without losing a pawn. Let's take. And yeah, we are up so many pawns. So many pawns. Let's just go b5. We have 4 passed pawns. The white pawns are incredibly weak. I'm actually going to bring this rook around just to defend the a pawn, because this pawn is going nowhere. So we'll start pushing these probably, distract the king, and then start pushing the h-pawn, get our king involved potentially. Up 4 pawns, we should have no problem converting this. My opponent did a good job of trying to create some positional counterplay once he was down material, but just not quite enough, really. Let's push. If this is okay, because I will push b4, and if you come to d6, then I'll give a check, and the e6 pawn is defended. Now we probably just push. And yeah, the pawns are just rolling. Our rook is a great piece. You can try to sack your rook to win the e6 pawn, but it's just not enough, and my opponent resigns. So maybe it was slightly easier for me to just bring my king to f7, to be fair. That's probably the easier way to go about it, but yeah, very interesting game. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let's jump into the analysis and see what the computer has to say. Okay, so 88.5% accuracy for my opponent, 91.9 for us. Looks like a very solid game, to be fair. So let's jump into it. E4, C6, D4, D5, and E5, the advanced Caro Kann. Like I said, I mostly play C5 immediately, the Botvinnik Carl's defense. But I've been toying with bishop to f5. One, because c5 can lead to some uncomfortable positions sometimes for black. But also because a lot of you have been asking for bishop to f5, because I know a lot of you play it. So I've been trying to learn it myself. So bishop f5. C4 is a move I've never seen before. Taking is not the best. E6 is better. Now, my issue with this was pawn c5, which I was concerned about. And I did see b6, b4, a5. And apparently this is just almost winning for black. Huh. So this is the best line for white. Yeah, no, this is just very good for black, isn't it? This is very nice. Okay, well, I took, which is not the best line, but yeah, I think the thing is, I assumed this c5 pawn would be a problem, and if I am too slow, then it probably is a problem. Like, if white gets time to build up a big defense for it, then, I don't know, maybe this is a little bit uncomfortable, but the engine really doesn't think so. Yeah, bc5, bc5. Really, it likes this. Anyway, bishop c4, e6. This is completely reasonable, and I figured this d4 pawn would just become weak over time. Knight c3, knight d7, knight f3, knight b6. We're literally just trying to control this d5 square. h6. Computer prefers knight to e7. I was concerned about knight to h4. The engine... Okay, now it wants h6, giving up the bishop to put the knight on f5. Okay, going after this. So bishop to e3. Queen d7, castle. This is the engine line. Bishop e7. Let's say queen d2. Okay, it wants the castle queenside. Rook d1. And yeah, I suppose we're controlling d4 very nicely. We control d5 very nicely, which is always great to control the square in front of a backwards pawn to stop it from trading itself off. And it just thinks this is a nice position. So, okay, I went h6. h3 from my opponent. A little bit of a waste of time. Better just to castle, which is what I was expecting. And then I was going to go knight to e7, and I thought that this was comfortable. Now with knight to h4, we just have bishop back to h7, and we're doing very well. So my opponent goes h3, knight to e7, castles, knight e to d5. Computer prefers bishop g6, and if a move like bishop to e3, now it wants knight to f5. I thought that the knight on f5 made my bishop kind of pointless because it can't actually see anything, which is why I instead went knight to d5. And the point was, if my opponent takes, then I take. And if my opponent takes, then I take. And I never put a pawn on d5. I always have a piece on d5, which is important. So the d file remains open. That was my whole idea. I would also never, ever, ever take the knight. That would be very silly, because now d4 is very well protected, and I don't have good access to c3, which is the base of the pawn chain. My opponent, of course, blunders his knight, which was very nice of him, and we take it, and then he decides to trade all the pieces with us, which is also very nice of him. Here, the game is actually almost equal if we take with the c-pawn and allow this check. Like, I guess that's what my opponent was banking on, which was a devious idea, because normally you do take with the c-pawn. But okay, ed5, bishop e3, bishop e7, queen d2, bishop g5 offering a queen trade, and then bishop to f2. And my opponent does get g4. I just realized that we could have just gone queen g6, pinning the pawn to the king. That was actually just very lazy of me to miss that. Very lazy. And then just play a move like this, even. Okay, here apparently white has very good counterplay. But anyway. I take on g4, which is still fine. Queen h5, king g2, queen g6, bishop g3. This is the bad move. Okay. So bishop h4 is our one inaccuracy of the game. So the engine wants queen f5, which is a move that I played later on. I saw this move, stopping the advancement of the pawns. And after rook f3, he wants king d7. Of course. Of course, king d7. Yeah. Yeah, the problem is, it wants to either advance the h-pawn and then put the king on d7, or put the king on d7 and then advance the h-pawn. I don't want to do that. That's risky. I went bishop h4, trying to force trades. But here, the engine thinks that we are winning, but less winning than we should be, considering we're up 2 pawns. So I go g6. Castling, I thought, made no sense, because we're just castling into an attack, and the engine agrees. The game is almost equal, and we actually have to give up g7 pawn to force rook trades, and then try and win the queen endgame, which we should probably win, but it's not going to be easy. So I go g6, pawn b4, a6, just stopping any advancement. Here I expected the move a4, trying to force this through anyway, but my opponent went rook e1, queen f5, e6, and we take. And now we're up 3 pawns. The engine wants to do this? Oh, that's actually really cool. That's really cool. So the best move is actually king d7. And let's say double up. Well, no, then we win this. So let's say queen e3. Oh, no, then we just take. So rook e5. Okay, that makes sense. Queen f6. Now let's say you double up. Well, then we're going to force trades anyway. So this is actually fine for black, But yeah, rook e5, queen f6. Again, this is the best move. My opponent goes queen e3, and we go king to f7, just keeping hold of all the pawns. I actually thought he was going to do this, but then I realized that f4 was hanging, so he can't do that. Queen e3, king f7, queen f3, and I just bring my rook in to overprotect the e-pawn. And then we go king g7, preparing to counterattack. And here I like the move h5. I was actually setting a trap. If a move like a4, I was going to go h5, setting the trap of rook takes h5, which would be losing. Because after rook h5, queen h5, it looks like you're winning a pawn, except there is rook h8, and your queen is pinned to your king. So that was my little trap. My opponent didn't fall for it. He went rook to e3, h5, kicking the queen away to take some pressure off of e6. Of course, if you keep the pressure, then I'll win the f4 pawn, which would be great. So queen g3, rook h2, f8, rook f3, king h6. Just getting off of the h-file so that you can't do this. King g2, queen e7 is the best move. And the whole point is to get the rook to f5. I was very happy with queen e7. I was expecting rook f to e3, which is the best move. Because I'm not actually going to take here, because then I allow unnecessary counterplay. Firstly, there's just rook takes here. Secondly, the engine actually wants rook takes h5 check, and if we take, we get mated, which is pretty funny. But rook f5, we get that in, because my opponent instead goes a3, which is what we wanted. And then rook e to f8. I didn't take here because of f takes, and I thought we can force the trade, to be fair, but I don't know. My king felt a bit weak. I preferred to just double up first. King e2. Now I take, because now if you take the f pawn, then I'll just do this probably, and then I don't know. Queen h4 looks okay. No, this actually allows a perpetual. Okay, it's not that simple. Maybe just rook to f5 would be good. Is that good? Yeah, it is. G takes, and this is on the way, although there is queen g8 first, so it's still not simple. My opponent took with the d pawn, though, keeping pieces on the board. We go rook f5, locking it all up, and then c5 just to break through. Pretty basic. Just force the queen trade, push the flank pawns. To be fair, I probably should have played king g7 here. Just it's more simple. We just secure e6, secure g6, and then we invest in the passed pawns. I went a5, though. I'd calculated that king d6 can always be met with rook a6, but it was a little bit unnecessary. And then we just go b3, and my opponent resigns, because there is nothing he can do. A rook cannot stop two pawns on the 6th rank, which is about to happen, let alone with another rook behind them supporting them. So yeah, very interesting game. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you want to see another very cool Caro Kann game, check out the video up here. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down there. Thank you all for watching. I really appreciate you guys who stick around to the very, very end, particularly. And I'll see you in the next video.